The National Register for Sex Offenders is set to be published on Friday. The Justice and Constitutional Development Minister, Mamoloko Kubai, says there is a need to make the names of convicted sex offenders public. The minister believes that this decision will help curb violence against women and children. Well, let's discuss what this means from a research and expert point of view as well. And researcher at the University of Johannesburg, Lisa Vetten, and Phinah Kodisang, the Soul City Institute CEO, join me now. Phinah, perhaps to kick off with you. The NSRO was established about 20 years ago, and this is the National Register for Sex Offenders, and the information contained therein has been confidential up until now. What do you think about the minister's plans to make it public? Good morning, by the way, and welcome. Where are my manners?
Good morning, Iman, and thank you for having me. I think it's important, right, that this register is made public. So as Soul City, we do endorse, but also we note that it cannot be it all and end it all by itself, right? There is the need for comprehensive, tools and systems put in place to deter perpetrators from violating, but also that we need to know who these people are, because the secrecy in terms of the offenders is what creates an enabling environment for more perpetration. And you are right in saying it's a 20-year-old tool, so it's nothing new, it's nothing that should shock us, but it's something that has been there and has been amended to include all offenders, not only the ones that offend children and people with disabilities. So it is a tool that can be used not as a punishment tool. It must never be seen as a punishment tool, but as a tool to protect, those who fall victim to violence.
Right. I mean, the stark difference in the last 20 years, Phinah, then would be the fact that now there's this decision made to be able to release this register and make it public. Lisa, your thoughts on this? Do you support this decision by the minister?
No, I think it adds no value in any way, really, to the fight against gender-based violence. And I think there are far more important initiatives that the minister should be approaching with a sense of great urgency. It should have much better effect at I think, attending the circumstances of current victims who must navigate the criminal justice system, and I think would, in the long run, be much more preventive than the release of the sex offenders register. I mean, I think because it's been in effect for some 20-odd years, it came into effect in about 2010, we know a great deal about its shortcomings. And I think it is concerning that those have not been taken into account. And instead, I think we have this rather unrealistic sense that the register is going to offer protection.
Well, what were the shortcomings, Lisa?
Well, I'm going to give you an example. I work with organizations who work in the Child Protection Centre in Gauteng. They have to provide evidence, which in the form of a clearance certificate from the Registrar of the National Sex Offenders Register, to show that their staff have been checked against the register and cleared. Many of these organizations are putting their applications in 2023. They are still waiting for the department to confirm whether or not their staff have been cleared. So I think we have to acknowledge the fact that there is a backlog. So whatever list you're looking at, it's not going to be an up-to-date list. I think the other thing that people persistently forget is that we are only talking about those who are convicted in a court of law. We are not talking about people who are found guilty, for example, in a disciplinary tribunal or at work or at university. So the vast number of people who offend will never end up on that register.
Right.
Last year, in fact, less than 10% of reported rapes resulted in conviction. So people must be under no illusions that this is in any way comprehensive.
Yeah, and we'll come back to the deficiencies in the list itself, but the principle that Phinah is sharing is that when somebody is convicted of, child sexual offence, that information should be available to everyone in society. So, Phinah, I'd just like your response and your follow-up to the opposition to the public releasing of this list and some of the reasons why that Lisa's sharing with us.
We do have a systemic failure within the justice system. It's not a secret, right? And because of that failure, we are then trying different methods to try and curb, to try and deter, to try and prevent and respond. So like I said earlier, it's not a comprehensive tool. It cannot be used on its own. It still requires many other things to be put in place. We still need to do a lot of education to people in terms of reporting their violation and also follow up for cases to be brought to the courts and for the justice system to do its work, right? So everything that we put in place or that is put in place should not be seen as an end in itself. It should be seen as a contribution to the bigger picture where we are trying to solve a complex problem, because GBV is a complex problem and it requires complex solutions.
Lisa, you're hearing there that this should be part of a toolkit of responses. So, barring the inadequacy or the lack of this being a comprehensive list, what are some of the other reasons why you think, you know, people who are working, and I heard you say as well that it takes very long to actually verify whether someone's on the list or not. One is hoping that now that it's going to be made public that these checks and balances would be there and the turnaround time would be quicker. But, you know, the list is what it is. Why shouldn't it be shared with those who have concerns about these individuals working with the very people that they've been convicted of abusing in the past?
Well, I think there are a couple of policy issues that this raises. I mean, from a practical point of view, if we look at the US, for example, which has had Megan's Law in place since 1994, which allows for the publication often on websites, depending on the particular state's laws, which has allowed for the public the publication of sex offenders' details. The conclusion, because some of the research started being undertaken 10 years after Megan's Law was first implemented, the conclusion of researchers was that it has made no difference, that it had not in any way reduced the amount of sex offending. And I think what it had done, and I think this is something we need to think about very, very carefully, is what does a sex offenders register say to us about the quality of rehabilitation, the quality of parole and probation that we put in place, and also the important policy questions about the reintegration of offenders into society? Because what must you do with this list once you've got it? Are you entitled to go and start protests around somebody outside somebody's house? Are you allowed to deny them housing and to refuse to allow them jobs? Does the department then propose setting up warehouses or camps where people can go and live if nobody will give them any kind of accommodation? So those are policy questions about integration. And I think by not looking at that, we are failing to ask important questions about what is happening with the Department of Correctional Services, Rehabilitation and Parole programs. And we have a classic example there of, I think, the release of the two men accused of raping and almost murdering Alison Botha. Despite a psychologist having argued against the release of those men on parole, the parole board still went ahead and recommended their release. So you see, I think if we pay attention to those kinds of circumstances, because not all those who commit sex offenders will reoffend and are potential murderers. We must keep that in mind. They are different. How do we create these checks and balances and understand these distinctions?
The Megan's Law that Lisa's talking about relates to the murder of Megan Kanker by a neighbour who was who was a previously convicted child sex offender. So, you know, and that's a research that she's quoting in terms of it's not having been effective in reducing sexual offences or offences of a sexual nature in the US. Phinah, I'd like to bring you back in on what Lisa is saying about it not being an effective enough tool, and that the focus should also then be placed on correctional services. I know that you've been at pains to say this morning this is not the be-all and end-all. It should be part of a collective response in South Africa. But I'd like for you to reflect on, again, some of the problems that Lisa's pointing out with this.
Yeah, like I said, any tool, any system, any process will have its flaws. But we must also balance, you know, what will not work with what can work and will be able to deter. Remember, we are solving a bigger problem here. And the fact that the justice system itself has its flaws cannot then prevent us from trying to create awareness around those who live among us who are offenders, because at least if we know, even as we bring people into employment places who come and work with children, who come and work, in any workspace, whether it's children or anybody else, we need to know, who are we bringing in. So the vetting process, which this list will also enable, really helps to know who the perpetrators are, because remember, we are talking about those who are convicted. So it's not just going to look at anybody else as alleged until they are proven. So once proven, your name should be made public so that people know that this is what we are dealing with. And of course, we need to also make sure that we put in place protective systems to make sure that vigilantism then doesn't take place, where people want to take the law into their hands. Because anywhere where there's an absence of an effective system, you will find these things coming up where everyone is trying everything to solve this problem. So this justice system needs to perfect itself. It needs to be operational in a way that gives justice, to the survivors and the victims of gender-based violence. And also, we should not be seen to be apologists and protecting perpetrators. We need really to make sure that the perpetration is deterred at all costs. And the list, I believe, will, to some extent, try and do that.
And that's the overriding theme we hear, Lisa, and I'll give you the final word on this, that this would serve to be a deterrent. So in a few days, we will, as a nation, know the names of the 32,501 registered sex offenders in South Africa. And given, again, as you say, there are concerns that this is an imperfect system. What are your expectations of what will happen once those names and that list goes live? Lisa? I think we might have lost her. She was joining us on the line. Her signal had failed. We're going to leave the conversation there. It's one that is by no means over because there's still so much work that needs to be done. For example, how long do you stay on the list?